everyone. It's Derek Chollet from GMF, and I'd like to welcome you to today's book talk with my friend Jonathan Alter to talk about his terrific new book, a biography of Jimmy Carter entitled His Very Best, Jimmy Carter, A Life. Jonathan is well known to many of you as a longtime journalist, author, television documentarian, award-winning in all of those walks of life. He's an analyst on MSNBC. He's the author of several terrific books about other presidents, including one called The Promise, about Barack Obama's first year in office, The Defining Moment, about FDR's first 100 days, and other books. But this new book on Jimmy Carter is the first true full biography of the president, and it's received wide acclaim, and it's really a insightful and deeply thoughtful book. So I really appreciate, Jonathan, you joining us today to talk about this book and Jimmy Carter. Jonathan, welcome.
Thanks, Derek. It's great to be here. I'm a big admirer of the German Marshall Fund for years, actually.
Thank you so much. Well, it's great to have you here. We're going to talk, Jonathan and I, the two of us, but I really welcome your questions and comments, and please use the Q&A function to offer those. But to start things off, Jonathan, you talk about Carter as perhaps the most misunderstood president in U.S. history and surprisingly consequential. But to start things off, I'd like to read back to you something you wrote right in the very beginning of the book that was, I have to say, it's quite humbling to read this. It's talking about Carter and his many talents. And I think we often don't think of him this way, but in many ways, he is a sort of a Jeffersonian Renaissance man. And you say, you know, over the course of his very long life, and of course, he's still with us today, that Jimmy Carter acquired the skills of a farmer, surveyor, naval officer, electrician, sonar technologist, nuclear engineer, businessman, equipment designer, agronomist, master woodworker, Sunday school teacher, bird dog trainer, arrowhead collector, land use planner, legislator, door-to-door missionary, governor, long shot presidential candidate, US president, diplomat, fly fisherman, home builder, global health expert, painter, professor, memoirist, poet, novelist, and children's book author. We were joking ahead of time. I feel like I'm maybe competent at one, maybe two things, and one of those involves making pancakes. So, I mean, here you look at, you think of Jimmy Carter and what he's been able to achieve with his life, not only as a successful politician and U.S. president, but just someone with so many skills. So why is he so misunderstood? Because I think we often, in the American political context, Jimmy Carter, be equated with Jimmy Carter presidentially is seen as an insult. It's almost the definition of failure. You make a very strong case in this book that that's absolutely the wrong way to think about it. But talk a little bit about the historical memory of Carter, how we got to this point, and what you're trying to say differently.
So the reason that we think this way about him is that he was crushed by Ronald Reagan when he ran for re-election in 1980. And all of us, but especially the press, tends to assess politicians by how they do politically. And then it's up to historians to come along and say, well, actually, the record matters a lot too, not just how they were doing politically. But in Carter's case, the stench that was attached to him was in some ways worsened by the fact that he didn't really have good personal relationships with a lot of other politicians. He wasn't well liked in that community, the way, say, George H.W. Bush, who also lost the White House, was. And Bush came from the heart of the establishment. So all of that establishment support for him came to the fore. Carter was always an outsider. I mean, he was even an outsider when he went to school in Plains, population at that time 450. He was raised on a farm outside of Plains in a community of 25 called Archery, Georgia. And when he would go to school in Plains, starting when he was 6 or 7 years old, he was an outsider then. And for the rest of his life, he has continued to be this outsider. And then, so I think he didn't do himself any favors by the way he criticized a number of his successors, including his Democratic successors, Clinton and Obama, very outspoken. And so what I concluded about him after basically researching him for 5 years is that he was a political failure, but a substantive and even far-sighted success. And I think a careful look at the record bears that out. And I'm willing to take on all comers, in terms of that verdict.
Mhm. Well, let's talk a little bit about how he rose to such prominence. The first 300 pages or so of the book are about his pre-presidential years, and as you point out, in many ways he was an improbable president, a one-term governor of Georgia. Went from zero in the polls when he got into the race to, of course, winning in 1976. So talk a little bit about his early years and his trajectory that got him to the presidency.
Well, he has led a novelistic life, and his story is really an American epic. He went from barefoot boy, barefoot most of the year, no running water, no electricity. His family was not poor by the standards of community, but he might as well have been living in the 19th century. He was born in 1924, but it might as well have been much earlier. And I argue he's the only president who really, in essence, lived in 3 centuries. His childhood was 19th. Obviously, he was president and connected to the major movements of the 20th century. And then what the Carter Center does with conflict resolution, global health, democracy promotion, these are the cutting edge issues of the 21st century that he's involved in. But his father was a white supremacist. His mother was a nurse who took care of Black patients. He was raised largely by an illiterate Black woman farmhand named Rachel Clark, who taught him about spirituality and nature. And he became the greatest environmental president this country has had since Theodore Roosevelt. He, from an early age, he wanted to see the world. He had an uncle who was in the Navy, who actually, during World War II, was given up for dead. The Red Cross declared him dead, and his wife married somebody else. And then when he came back alive after being imprisoned in Japan, there was this big, really colorful family drama surrounding it, where he wanted to get back with his wife and couldn't. And Jimmy was very, very upset with his mother and his aunts for preventing his uncle from remarrying his original wife. And his uncle was a real role model for him. And he sent him postcards and scrimshaw and other things from all over the world. And from a very young age, Jimmy wanted to go to the Naval Academy, which he eventually did. And that kind of introduced him to this wider world, first person in his family to go to college. So then he becomes part of the nuclear, before this, and this is important for what happens later, when he's on a submarine, he joins the submarine corps. They are just offshore in 1949. His 25th birthday on October 1st, 1949 was the climax of the Chinese Revolution. And he sees from when the subsurface, they could see, they were close enough to the shore to see the fires of the nationalists as they're retreating. And then the war ends when they're off the coast of China. In some cases, they'd just been in port when the nationalists held China. So he witnesses that. And as a boy earlier, he had sent donations, nickels, to Chinese American missionaries in China, which he later discusses with Deng Xiaoping. And I actually argue that Jimmy Carter was in some ways the greatest Christian missionary in world history, because after Deng Xiaoping came to the US when Carter was president, um, as he is leaving, Deng says to Carter, "You've been so nice to me. Is there anything that I can do for you?" And Carter, as we know, is a very religious man, says, "Well, as a boy, I sent nickels to Chinese missionaries. And so it would be wonderful if you opened up China to missionaries again and you allowed churches and Bibles in China." And Deng Xiaoping didn't say anything. And then the next day, as he prepared to leave, and unfortunately, there was no State Department or NSC note taker there. So, as I say, unfortunately for a historian, I have to rely on Carter's version of this. So, let me stipulate that. But what Carter says is that Deng Xiaoping said to him, "Look, Chinese missionaries were not good to my people. And, at the turn of the century and later, I can't allow them to come in. But I see no reason why Chinese should not be able to have Bibles and go to church if they choose to do so." And he did it. When Carter went to China as a former president, there were hundreds of thousands and eventually millions more Chinese Christians than there had been. Now, the church was regulated by the state, but nonetheless, they were able to practice and are able to practice a form of Christianity that they had not been earlier. So that's just one example of many of how Carter's youth connected to what he did when he was in office.
Mm-hmm. Well, I definitely want to get in a bit to some of the specifics of his foreign policy. Before we get to that, just hear from you a little bit more about his political rise and how he and kind of embed him a bit within the politics of the moment, but how someone like him, who was relatively unknown in the early 1970s, all of a sudden becomes president of the United States in 1976.
So you have to start with the least flattering part of Carter's career. So when he's in the Navy, the Naval Academy and the Navy, he becomes an integrationist, and he defends the first black midshipman against hazing at Annapolis. And then he won't go to a party that the Governor General of the Bahamas invited his crew to on the submarine because he didn't invite the black shipmate. So we know who Carter is, and he's very supportive of Harry Truman desegregating the armed forces. But then after his father dies, he leaves the Navy, he returns, and he's been working for Admiral Rickover on the most exciting project of the middle part of the 20th century, the most exciting tech project. And Colin Powell says that Rickover basically won the Cold War for the United States because the Soviets could never match nuclear-powered submarines and how long they could stay underwater. In any event, he leaves Rickover's service when his father dies, and he returns to Plains, Georgia, and for 18 years, he ducks the civil rights movement. And then he runs for governor the second time, what can only be called a dog whistle campaign. He doesn't say anything racist, but he creates the impression for the racists that he's on their side, on the side of the segregationists. Then 1 minute, literally 1 minute after he takes the oath as governor of Georgia, he says in his inaugural address, "The time for racial discrimination is over." This was mind-blowing. So his former colleagues from the state Senate in Georgia walk out, and the black Georgians in attendance he said, "What?" They couldn't believe it. And then he goes on to be a very progressive governor of Georgia and integrates the Georgia government. And that inaugural address is on the front page of the New York Times. And he later is on the cover of Time magazine as the face of the new South. So this is kind of what started to put him on the map, but it would not have made him president if it wasn't for Watergate. So when he runs for president in 1976, it's just 2 years. Well, he starts running 6 months after Nixon resigns. And so he's basically made by Watergate. And then I would argue that he's unmade by Watergate, because the Washington Press Corps, which loved him in 1976, and his message of, very similar to Biden's message of healing after Watergate and the lies of Vietnam. And he says, I won't lie to you. And this message of integrity is a perfect fit for the electorate. And he rides it to the presidency, although he won very narrowly over Gerald Ford. But then the press corps, they assume that he's like Nixon. And so, as his press secretary said, he not only didn't get a honeymoon, he didn't even get a one-night stand with the media. And from the very start, he's on the defensive, and he did not handle things well. He did not set up his White House in a smart way, and he made a number of mistakes. Nonetheless, he was in the 70s in popularity in his first year in office. 20, more than 20 points higher than Trump ever got. But then in the second half of his time in office, he was swamped by events in the economy and global events, the invasion of Afghanistan, the Iran hostage crisis, and other things that we've forgotten about.
Well, so let's talk about his foreign policy. And I'm curious to hear from you about Jimmy Carter's worldview. So as his rise to prominence is underway and he's getting more national attention, so you've already mentioned his first exposure to China, which I think I certainly didn't know back from his Navy days. But how did he look at the world, and how did that worldview take shape? Like, what were how did he begin to think about America's role in the world and what the challenges and opportunities were for the United States?
So I think for any political figure of that period, it starts with the Vietnam War. And he was very late to opposing the Vietnam War, like a lot of Southern moderate politicians. And, he had been in the military himself. He was a strict disciplinarian with his 3 sons. He has 3 older sons who are much older than Amy Carter. And he would, paddle them, and very strict. When he was governor, William Calley went on trial at Fort Benning, Georgia. And he
for the My Lai massacre, for folks who didn't know that. Yeah.
And he basically declared, Fighting Men Day in Georgia. And Calley was so popular that he essentially played to that a little bit. And then in 1972, he gave the nominating speech for Scoop Jackson at the Democratic Convention. So he had a pretty conventional Cold War view, but also when he's governor, he goes to what he called the Holy Land for the first time and develops what can only be described as an obsession with issues related to the Middle East. And this is all tied up in his faith. And Golda Meir gives the governor a car, and he meets the players. He does not go to the West Bank, but he goes all over Israel, and he actually is surprised that Israelis are not more religious. He can't really understand why the synagogues are empty. And he later said if he was Jewish, he would have been an Orthodox Jew. And then he's put on the Trilateral Commission, which was started by David Rockefeller. And this Columbia professor named Zbigniew Brzezinski is the staff director, and they want a governor on. And Carter gets it, and he's put on the Trilateral Commission, which it's Western Europe, the United States, and Japan. And they have a series of conferences in the mid 70s, and a number of people who were on the Trilateral Commission became part of his administration. So he kind of imbibed the establishment views, foreign policy establishment views. And his top aide, Hamilton Jordan, said, if Cyrus Vance is Secretary of State and Zbigniew Brzezinski is National Security Advisor, we've failed. And that's what happened, right? So, but because Carter didn't have any real background in foreign policy, never been in the Senate, there was this assumption that he was a naif and that he was very prone to suggestion or whatever the recommendations were of his advisors. And this was something that I found to be one of the biggest misconceptions about him. So there were whole forests that died for newspaper articles, newsprint, describing the rivalry between Vance and Brzezinski. And I devoted very little, I didn't ignore it, but I devoted very little attention to it because Carter was always his own Secretary of State. And he was a very strong-willed, intense, and extraordinarily knowledgeable individual with an extraordinarily high IQ, who is not in the slightest bit suggestible. So the idea that he was, even though
and also very deep in the details,
way in the weeds, which he was criticized for endlessly to this day, he's criticized for that, but it actually is at the root of his greatest accomplishments, which we can talk about. Mm-hmm. But so, he's kind of conditioned by the Trilateral Commission, but the part of the sort of foreign policy establishment dimension to his worldview that is not complete is that he is above all a peacemaker. And everything starts with keep the bullets from flying. And this is why SALT II and arms control so important to him, why in his inaugural address, he talked about, eliminating nuclear weapons someday. This, which, comes from his faith, sort of conditioned everything and hurt him when it came to Iran, but helped him greatly when it came to Camp David and the Panama Canal Treaties and some of the other major achievements, human rights, I think the instinct for human rights was something that in some ways grew out of a political place, because Richard Holbrooke was one of his advisors on the 76 campaign. And he and Stu Eisenstadt, who was his main policy advisor, they saw an opening against the Kissinger realpolitik, that they could kind of catch a wave if they talked about human rights in the 76 campaign, when some liberal congressmen were starting to talk about it. So what became so identified with him, and which I really hope we get a chance to talk about because it's such an important part of his legacy, in some ways that came less from conviction than it did from a political opportunity at first.
Mm-hmm. Well, I did want to get into that because I want to talk about both the accomplishments, but also the setbacks in foreign policy for Carter. But let's start with human rights, because that's where I wanted to start. Was I think conventional wisdom of his foreign policy, that's one area where he does perhaps get some credit. And you do rightly point out that it maybe started from political expedience or opportunity, but yet it did sort of marry with conviction eventually because of, but talk a little bit about how he looked at this issue and then how he really changed the way that U.S. foreign policy should take into account human rights.
So, Jimmy Carter was hard to pin down. Is he a liberal? Is he a conservative? Is he a hawk? Is he a dove? He increased defense spending by 5%, and he's a military guy. But the important thing to understand about him is that he had both a moral ideology and he is an engineer. I have a chapter called His Inner Engineer. So he did not have a global strategic vision that was original to him because he's a problem solver. He's an engineer. So he saw a discrete series of problems, and he wasn't going to overlay this Wilsonian idealism on top of all of those problems because the specifics of them varied. I think what human rights does is it animates his worldview in a way that kind of absolves him of not having a really sophisticated strategic doctrine. And his speeches, although he's very smart, are not, some of them would be just kind of, in one case, literally stapling Brzezinski and Vance's drafts together. Just to start with human rights, it was a hypocritical policy. He's supporting the Shah of Iran, he's supporting Marcos in the Philippines. But when Karl Deutsch, who's a famous within the academy, professor of international relations at Harvard, was down visiting Emory University, where Carter has an appointment. And this is shortly after Carter left office. And he's with the president of Emory, Jim Laney, who had been ambassador to South Korea. And they run into Carter, on the path. And Deutsch stops and he says, President Carter, 1,000 years from now, there will be very few American presidents who are remembered, and you will be one of them because you were the first leader anywhere in the world who set a global standard for how governments should treat their people. It was a sovereignty issue in the past. The State Department might criticize Kristallnacht or something like that, but there was not, until Carter, there was no assistant secretary for human rights. Mm-hmm. There were no annual reports on human rights in other countries. Mm-hmm. These were established by Jimmy Carter. And this global standard for how governments treat their own people was established by Jimmy Carter. And then the other extraordinary thing that happened is that people like Larry Eagleburger, future Secretary of State, who was ambassador to Yugoslavia, who every time Pat Darien, Carter's inspiring assistant secretary of state for human rights, every time she would land in Belgrade, he would leave because he just knew that she was going to cause problems with Tito, and she would come and she would never unpack when she got to a country because she was never sure when the head of state was going to throw her out, right? And so years later, Larry Eagleburger, like Bob Gates, said we were wrong about Jimmy Carter's human rights policy. This was soft power, and it was very effective. And Václav Havel said the same thing. Not only was it a comfort to those in jail to hear the American president standing up for them, as he did, for Sharansky and Sakharov. At the very beginning, he starts his presidency writing a letter to Sakharov, the first week of his presidency. And this, I think, sophisticated historians of the end of the Cold War must take account of Carter's human rights policy, as Havel and so many others do, for hollowing out the authority of the Soviet Empire. But what he did on the Cold War was kind of less direct than what happened in Latin America, where basically the vast majority of the continent in the 10 years after Carter left office, moved to democracy. And then, just to give you one other example, there's a long, complicated history with all of these countries, and Carter was much criticized for wanting to pull troops out of South Korea. But when Kim Dae-jung, when he was in prison, and when he was inaugurated as the president of South Korea years later, and Pat Darien went to the inauguration, he told her, I wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for you and Jimmy Carter, much less president of South Korea. Mm-hmm. And, so there are like major consequences of this. The reason that we didn't see it earlier was partly because of the hypocrisy, because he was doing this during the Cold War when, he was balancing our Cold War interests with his human rights policy. Partly because the right wing attacked the policy so fiercely, although when I interviewed Elliot Abrams, he admitted that they continued the Carter human rights policy after Reagan became president. And then, of course,
and they want to start the clock at the Westminster speech.
Right. And then George W. Bush, if you look at his second inaugural, his whole foreign policy is human rights. And so there's a delayed consequence to some of what the groundwork that Carter laid. And the other factor is that after the invasion of Afghanistan, Pat Darien grew disillusioned because all of the talk about human rights stopped in the year 1980, the last year of Carter's presidency. And what Carter wrote in his diary that he was disappointed that in his policy, and he gave himself kind of low marks. This is the thing about Carter, just one of so many contrasts to Donald Trump, who gives himself A+ for everything. When Dan Rather interviewed him on the eve of the Democratic Convention in 1980, he asked him to grade himself, and like a fool, Carter did. And he gave himself, well, B- on this, I give myself a C+ on that, And at that time, they didn't know yet that the human rights policy would be as effective and important as it turned out to be. They didn't know that Camp David would hold and become the most durable treaty of the post-war era. So this is where historians come in, is to take the longer view. And mm-hmm. I was just fortunate enough that in biography form, nobody really had before me, and that even in terms of just scholarship, there was a paucity of it. I was astonished at how little scholarship there was on human rights, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I want to briefly tick through some of the major foreign policy accomplishments, some of the specifics. And let's start with the Panama Canal Treaty, which is something my guess is a lot of our listeners will not put top of mind when it comes to Carter's foreign policy or U.S. foreign policy, but you make a very interesting case in the book in a chapter on this treaty about how important it was and as a genuine accomplishment. So talk a little bit about that, and then I want to talk about, in very short order, we could go all day talking about these.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
We'll try to, Camp David, normalization with China, and then we obviously have to get to the Iran hostage crisis.
Okay. So Panama Canal treaties, it sounds pretty dry and ordinary, but this is how Ronald Reagan came to prominence in national politics. Was he said, it's ours, we're not giving it back. And he almost got the nomination in 76 over incumbent President Ford on that issue alone. So Carter comes to office. Everybody tells him it's a second term issue. Just don't touch it. It's just a complete loser for you politically. 2/3 of the country was against turning over the Panama Canal, and it required 2/3 of the US Senate for ratification. So this was the heaviest of heavy lifts politically. And as it turned out, 5 Democratic senators lost their seats over this. But what happened is the Joint Chiefs of Staff came in and said, look, if we don't ratify. First, Carter had to complete them, get the treaties completed before he could worry about ratification. And his attention to detail is very important in all of that. But the JCS said, if we don't turn over the canal, it will be sabotaged by terrorists in Panama. And once there's any incident, then we have to have 100,000 troops in Panama in perpetuity. And, and in perpetuity. And so a lot of people at the time, including Howard Baker, who was instrumental, the Republican minority leader in the Senate, he sided with Carter on those treaties. This was hugely important, even though a number of Democrats voted against the treaty. So things were not as partisan in those days. And Carter had to do all kinds of things that I won't get into to get these through. It was actually close to as virtuoso a performance as Camp David. And then when it was done, and Carter went down there and was the first president ever to give a speech in Spanish, and people still thought there would be problems. Then they had to get other legislation through the House, which nobody knows about. And it was a very close shave in the House to just appropriate the money for the handover. Then almost immediately, things started going really well. And they have, even though we've had some problems like with Noriega, there's been no issue with the canal, which is vital to global commerce, obviously. And when the final handover went through at the turn of the century, it was a non-event. Mm-hmm. And Reagan, by the way, when Reagan came to office, you would have thought he would have abrogated the treaties, which he so despised. No, he said this was the right thing to do. He never admitted that he was wrong about it, but he just continued the Carter policy.
Yeah, I have to say that the chapter on the Panama Canal Treaty is sobering to read in the context of today, just given the lift that was required to get 2/3 of the Senate to support this.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine.
Just one other quick note on that. So I was talking earlier about human rights and all of these Latin American dictatorships that ended up evolving into some form of democracy. The Panama Canal treaties was central to the human rights campaign in Latin America, because it ended this gringo go home thing, which had been, after all of our interventions in the 20th century, had been a huge problem for the United States and Latin America. And this gesture was so important and so popular throughout the region, turning over the canal and what it symbolized, that it was really central to major democratization. Mm-hmm. And finally, Rosalind Carter, who is an enormously formidable woman, she became the first diplomat first lady. Eleanor Roosevelt never did that. She went and met with heads of state on a diplomatic mission that was very, very successful. So she is a hugely formidable figure in her own right, who I give a lot of treatment to in the book. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, before we turn to Iran, I want to quickly have you touch on normalization with China and Camp David. Both those issues have been written about pretty extensively. I mean, Camp David, there's a Broadway play about Camp David, right there. Right. But so really for both of those, I'd be really interested in kind of how you think the story, you wanted to recast the story in the context of this broader life, and also just kind of what you draw from that as the most important historical lesson we should take from Carter, both on normalization with China and Camp David.
Okay, let me do Camp David first, and just briefly, because people know a lot more about it, and there have been many books written about it. What he did was super risky. Presidents are not really supposed to do negotiations. There are too many downside risks. But this thing that he was ridiculed for, his attention to detail, is what led to the deal at Camp David. And he had to separate Begin and Sadat on the second day. And so it was kind of a very unusual kind of diplomacy because they would fight too much when they were in the same room. And each packed bags and was ready to leave on several occasions. What I didn't know, and I'm sort of embarrassed to have not known, and by the way, Rosalind Carter's unpublished diaries were of great help for me in that Camp David chapter. I also have the steamy love letters that Jimmy wrote to her from the Navy. So I have all kinds of new documents. But what I didn't know is that after Camp David, which was September of 1978, the deal fell apart. The Israelis backed away, and 6 months later, Carter went to the Middle East in March of 79, and he had to put the whole thing back together with chewing gum and baling wire. And it almost didn't work then too. Largely, he had a great relationship with Sadat. This was largely because of Menachem Begin, but he eventually got it done. And it's a very dramatic story, how he did this. And nothing short of a virtuoso performance. So,
hey, Jonathan, if I can just interrupt you, and this is a technical issue on my end. I've just been told by my computer that I'm getting a patch update that I seem to be unable to turn off. So I'm gonna get my I'm gonna let you talk about China normalization, and I'll be back in like 2 minutes.
okay.
This is sort of a new reality of our Zoom era. I will be talking to my tech support after this to make sure this never happens again. But I'll see you in like 2 minutes.
Okay, I can easily talk about China for at
Yeah,
least.
exactly. And then we're going to get to Iran after my computer's fixed here. Okay. Thanks.
All right.
Okay.
So when Jimmy Carter is asked what
it may let me do the patch update while I'm on. So okay. if I disappear, keep going. Sorry for everyone. There we go.
So when Jimmy Carter is asked what is his longest lasting accomplishment, he doesn't say Camp David. He's actually a little disappointed in Camp David because while he brought peace between Israel and Egypt and took the only army that could destroy Israel, land army that could destroy Israel off the table, so Israel could no longer be driven in the sea, and made him the greatest president for the security of the state of Israel of any since Harry Truman, despite being the biggest critic of Israel rhetorically of any American president. In any event, the other part of that deal, which was setting up the peace process, didn't hold, as we all know. And even though it was the basis for Oslo and Clinton's deal and everything that came later, he was not able to bring a comprehensive Middle East peace, which was his greatest regret about not being reelected. So when he's asked, what was your biggest accomplishment in terms of longest lasting accomplishment? He says it was not Camp David. It was full diplomatic relations with China. So Nixon opened the door. Carter and Deng Xiaoping walked through the door, and they established what is now not only the most important bilateral relationship in the world, but the foundation of the global economy. So at the time Deng Xiaoping came to the United States in 1979, China's GDP was that of a sub-Saharan African nation. It's just impossible for us to imagine this now. And Deng Xiaoping knew that he could not, who was one of the great leaders in all of Chinese history, knew that he could not modernize China without the United States. And this was not something that a Republican president would have done, because at the time Carter came to office, we had this thing called a two-China policy. It was a relic of the Cold War, and we had these relations with Taiwan. And after Carter chose mainland China as the real China, when I believe it was Warren Christopher, when he went to Taipei, he was pelted with eggs and in a government-sanctioned violent demonstration against him. This is how angry Taiwan was. And the right wing in the United States never would have let a Republican president do what Carter did. And Carter actually made the decision over the objections of some of his advisors. Brzezinski was very involved in it, and he went and did a trip to China to kind of lay the groundwork for it. But not everybody thought that he should move forward this way. So he made the hard call to do that. And Deng Xiaoping's visit was very successful. Carter, by the way, his attention to detail also involved in the details of the deal between China and the United States, which had huge implications, the fine print. So just to give you one example, after Deng's visit, the science advisor, a guy named Frank Press, is in Beijing, and he's meeting with Deng Xiaoping. And he calls Carter in the middle of the night and wakes him up. And Carter, is told there's a call from Dr. Frank Press. Those are the days when the science advisor actually meant something in the White House. And he's, Carter's wondering, is this an earthquake somewhere? Is it another Mount St. Helens, which was an eruption, something that, no. And he's annoyed that he's being woken up. And Carter is easy to annoy. He's a very tough, intense guy beneath that smile, which is a whole other thing. Like, people's image of who Jimmy Carter is way off.
Well, and you have this great depiction of his 3 different smiles.
Yeah, this is Brzezinski first pointed out. Like, he has the big grin for the public, which is a little bit fake. Then he's got that tight-lipped smile when his icy blue eyes are boring into you, when you know that he's pissed at you, and he's not going to yell, but he's just, the temperature drops like 40 degrees, like when he's got that smile, and then he's got a genuine smile when he gets off, and he actually has a mordant, irreverent sense of humor, which I think a lot of people wouldn't imagine about Jimmy Carter. But anyway, he gets this call, and at that time, I might be getting these numbers off, but I think there were 50 Chinese students who were studying in the United States, kind of like a ping pong team thing left over from 1972 and Nixon, right? And Frank Press says, Vice Premier Deng is wondering if he can send 1,000 students to the United States this coming year. And Carter is annoyed. He goes, he can send 10,000 for all I care. Yeah, fine, whatever. I'm going to bed. And so how many Chinese students are there now studying in the United States? 250,000. And now, has that meant that, we have this lovely relationship with China? Do these cultural exchanges lead to that? No. I mean, Admiral Yamamoto, who was the architect of Pearl Harbor, went to Harvard, right? So there are limitations to what these relationships can do. But if you're looking at why we haven't had superpower conflict in the last 40 years, one of the reasons has to be that we have this web of connections with China. And the price of ending those economic ties, the collapse of the global economy, is not worth it to either side to get into a war over, right? So this normalization and the development of these ties is just so critical to the world that we live in. But most people think, oh, it was Nixon who did that. Well, sure. Carter, what did he have to do with it?
Right.
And it's just a misunderstanding of.
Well, in many ways, the hard work of, taking Taiwan, the China we recognize off its permanent seat at UN Security Council, and then giving it to mainland China is a pretty wrenching task that Carter had to do.
Right.
Okay, we've got just about 10 minutes left, and I need to talk about Iran, and then I want to do a kind of a lightning round at the very end of just quick questions for you. But on Iran, again, much has been written about the Iran hostage crisis. Movies have been made about it. So really interested to hear from you kind of what the top line takeaway for you in thinking about this in the context of Carter's life and presidency? And then there's a very specific question that Ray Takei, one of our great experts on Iran, a friend of mine, has asked about the consideration of a coup in Iran, the so-called option C, and that you depict in the book about how Carter was against that. If you could just speak to a little to that in your overall take on the Iran hostage crisis.
Okay, so the good news first, and then the not so good news for Carter and his place in history. The good news is the hostages all came home safely, and we were not dishonored as a nation by the negotiations for their release. And, you know, as everybody knows, they were released just moments after Reagan took the oath. Carter negotiated their release. And even though in some ways he was humiliated by that, he was very happy on the day he left office because his objective of bringing them home safely had been achieved. And there were all sorts of ways they could have ended up dead. But from the time of the Iranian Revolution which sort of started in late 78 and then took place in early 79, Carter did not apply his normal attention to detail that I've described to what became, after the Russian Revolution, the most important revolution of the 20th century. And so just to give you one example, the week that the Shah left Iran, they had a cabinet meeting, and Bella Abzug, the feminist who Carter had just fired because she, for reasons I won't go into, but he was right to fire her, but it caused a huge stink, and most of the cabinet meeting was devoted to that, and the Iranian Revolution was almost like a footnote. Now, the big question that Carter's critics have is, you know, did Carter lose Iran? And if he had stiffened the Shah's spine and told him to exercise option C, you know, would he have done it? And I deal with this at great length, and there's no clear answer, but my basic take is that it's the Shah's fault, not Carter's. That the Shah, who was a very bright and capable monarch, decided, as he said to somebody, one of his visitors, dictators shoot their own people. Monarchs do not. And I'm a monarch. So he had shot at Tahrir Square in 78. His troops had killed a lot of people. And he, even though, you know, he had plenty of opportunities to do that again, he thought it would be futile. He said at one point, you know, if I shoot them on one street, they'll just pop up on another street. It's not going to work. And you know, so, but there were other, so this idea that if, you know, which when I interviewed Kissinger, who was very complimentary of Carter on Camp David and number of other things, but he was really close friends with the Shah and later contributed to the hostage crisis because he was one of the people who put so much pressure on Carter to let the Shah in for medical treatment. He wanted to let him in before he was known to be sick. And that directly precipitated the seizure of the hostages. In any event, you know, Kissinger and others still peddle this line. Well, if only, you know, Carter had told the Shah, go ahead, shoot your people, the Shah would have done it. And the Shah himself said that later after he lost power. Well, you know, it's Carter's fault. Well, that's ridiculous. The Shah was making his own decisions. He was in a very unstable state. He had cancer and wasn't telling anybody. And, you know, I just find it implausible to blame Carter for the Shah being removed from power. But where I do blame Carter is in two areas. One is the Ayatollah is in Paris, and he comes back to Tehran with plane load of journalists. And it's kind of like Lenin going to the Finland station, right? So they knew by this point, or should have known better, what the Ayatollah's return to Iran would mean. And Carter focused on it a little bit. He tried to get Giscard to do certain things, but there was no covert operation. There was no original imaginative thinking on how do we keep the Ayatollah in France. Instead, they had some diplomatic feelers in France that sort of were trying to appease the Ayatollah a little bit. And Carter never called him Gandhi. That was just a lie. Carter was never under any illusions about the Ayatollah, but he did not have a deep understanding, to put it mildly, of Islamic fundamentalism. Nobody did. And many people in Washington didn't know the difference between Shiites and Sunnis. And at one point, Walter Mondale was heard in the hall asking, what is an Ayatollah? What does that mean? So it's a little bit like when McCarthyites cleaned out the State Department of China experts, after the Chinese Revolution. Like, okay, now we're flying blind. So of course we're going to think stupid things like China and the Soviet Union are on the same page. It was a little bit like that later on with Iran experts. So they were flying blind. So he wasn't imaginative then. Then later, when it came to getting the hostages out, he played into the Ayatollah's hand and remember Nightline was originally called America Held Hostage. Carter let himself be held hostage by the Ayatollah. And he could have done something short of full-scale military operations. He could have mined harbor, Karg Island. He could have taken that over, an island off of Iran. It probably wouldn't have worked, but there was just kind of a lack of imagination in how to deal with the Iran hostage crisis that I fault him for.
Mm-hmm. Well, your account of the crisis is well worth it. I highly recommend it to everyone. In addition to the works by Gary Sick and others who've written great books about the Iran hostage crisis. Okay, we are about at time, so I want to ask you a couple quick questions. First, this, as you said, this is 5 years of research that went into this book. You went through many archives. You spent I don't know how many hours with President Carter. What surprised you the most in writing this book? As you say, it's a revisionist history in many ways of Jimmy Carter as a politician, as a president, as a leader, but you're someone who's watched politics up close for many, many, many years. What changed in your own mind about Carter in researching this book?
I think it was the complexity of him. He's decent at his core, which kept me going because it was such a relief from Trump. And I some readers have described it in the same way, a kind of a inspiration in a dark time to read about Jimmy Carter. But, the decency didn't really surprise me. The complexity of his story, the layers to him, the fact that you can't get his number, and I don't pretend that I have a definitive take on Jimmy Carter. And these are the fascinating characters in history. As Stephen Colbert says of Trump, Trump's boring. Like, we know exactly who he is. There's nothing to learn and be surprised by. And Jimmy Carter is just the opposite, both on the plus side and the negative side. I mean, there were certain ways in which he did, for instance, we haven't talked about his post-presidency, but there was, people talk about how humble he is. There were elements of his post-presidency that were shot through with egotism, and there were some real things he accomplished, like in the foreign policy side in Haiti and North Korea, but which have also been misunderstood by some other analysts. But he would do a star turn on CNN, and you can understand why his successors did not like having a freelance Secretary of State who they couldn't control. So there were, I guess the answer is, I was constantly surprised, even to when I visited with them both in Plains and in Atlanta, when they're in Atlanta a week a month, they sleep on a Murphy bed. You know, they decided to take what was the bedroom and give that to Rosalind for her office and the apartment that the government gives them at the Carter Library. And, you know, Jimmy, until he had a bad fall last year, would mow the grass at the church that they go to. And Rosalind would be vacuuming the sanctuary. I mean, while he's not humble in every respect, there is a modesty and humility to the way he leads his life. And of course, he didn't cash in on having been president.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time and we didn't get to the post-presidency. Something, the point you make in this book, which I think is really interesting, is that he was an underrated president and an overrated ex-president.
Yeah, I mean, he's been an inspirational former president, but you don't have any power when you're not in office.
Right.
We didn't even get to, Jimmy Carter signed 14 major pieces of environmental legislation.
Right.
Because now we have presidents where they're like just 2 or 3 major bills in 4 years.
Yeah.
And they had one every month of the.
Yeah, and that was a really interesting part. They're kind of recasting of him as almost like an LBJ in some ways, and what he was able to get done.
LBJ because he was so ham-handed. So he got 80% of what he wanted. If he'd been LBJ, he would have gotten 95% of what he wanted with a Democratic Congress, which he had for 4 years. Clinton and Obama only had a Democratic Congress for 2 years. So there was all this legislation. Just one very quick thing, like Trump would never have been impeached if it wasn't for the Ethics in Government Act of 1978 that protected whistleblowers and the Inspector General's Act of 1978 that established Inspector Generals. And there's dozens of things like this that affect our lives to this day that nobody remembers were done by Jimmy Carter.
All right, one last question, Jonathan. Jimmy Carter, as I said, he's very much alive. I forget which birthday he's celebrated. 96. So, and you spent a lot of time with him and Rosalind Carter in researching this book. What's his response been, to the extent you know? I mean, how has he reacted to the book and the publicity around it?
Well, after his fall and he had a subdural hematoma, he doesn't read anymore. I used to have a great email relationship with him. Like at one point, I asked him in an email question, do you have anything in common with Donald Trump? And I got back a one-word answer, no. But I could ask him like 10 fact-checking questions or other things, and I'd get full responses from him. So I haven't been able to do that lately. Nobody can. So he's listening to the book. A wonderful actor named Michael Boatman reads the audio book, and he's listening to it. Rosalind Carter is reading it. They're not, according to what I heard last week, they're not done with it yet. They don't love everything in it, but they are happy that somebody finally came along to give them their due.
Well, give them their due, you did. And thank you very much for writing this book. It is a terrific read. It's an overlooked part of American history, and it is very much, I think you make a compelling case, an overlooked presidency on domestic policy and foreign policy. So thanks, Jonathan, for writing it. Thanks for taking the time this morning to be with us. It's been a great conversation. I could talk to you for another hour or so at least. So I look forward to keeping up the conversation offline. Again, everybody, please go to your local bookseller and order a copy of this book or pick one up. His Very Best, Jimmy Carter, Our Life by Jonathan Alter. Thank you again for doing this. Congratulations.
Thanks for having me, Derek.
All right. Take care, everybody. Everyone stay safe, be healthy.